Which is easy to learn out of Spanish and Italian for a native English speaker? Hello and welcome back to the Story Learning podcast. It still feels great to be saying this after such a long break. It's funny because I've been saying these words, welcome back to the Story Learning podcast for years and years and years on end. And then I took this long break. But now I'm back and I've got this kind of nostalgic novelty feeling when I introduced the podcast. Anyway, it's great to be back here. And the podcast has had something of a cracking start. As you may know, we publish the podcast now on lots of different platforms, including YouTube. And also on Spotify, we also have the video podcast. So if you're listening to this on Spotify, you can click a little button or press a little button on your screen and it will switch it over. It should switch it over to video so you can actually see me in my home office, sitting here, holding my iPad, recording this podcast for you. So for those of you who like to watch video, you can do that on Spotify, but also on YouTube. But many of the episodes that we've just recorded have been getting quite large numbers of views, largely thanks to people discovering the podcast on YouTube. And this has been quite unexpected, but really great to see. And it shows, I suppose, that this desire that people have to learn languages and learn about language learning is still as strong as ever. So that's awesome. Today, we are answering a question from Dean Howell 5936, who asks, which is easier to learn out of Spanish and English for a native... No, that was completely wrong. Sorry, Dean, let me do that again. Which is easier to learn out of Spanish and Italian for a native English speaker? Your first language is English. Which are you going to find easier, Spanish or Italian? Interesting question. I've learned both of these languages, so I'm going to be able to talk you through my experience and what I found. On the whole, most people would say that both Spanish and Italian are considered easy languages for English speakers. Easy is obviously a relative term. Learning any new language to a high level is difficult, but in the grand scheme of things, when you're comparing with some of the more difficult languages around the world, Spanish and Italian are relatively easy. But you know, in the end, I always have a kind of a strange feeling about this question of, which language is easier or harder, because you could compare a relatively simple language like Spanish with a relatively difficult language like Mandarin Chinese, and you could give a technical answer to, which is easier, which is harder. But at the end of the day, it kind of depends which you're most motivated to learn in your own life, right? So if you're just learning another language to kind of collect languages, you don't really have any underlying motivation to learn it at all. But if you're learning a difficult language because maybe you've married someone from that language, you've got a kid who's now bilingual, you're living in the country, well, suddenly you've got some pretty deep-rooted reasons to learn that language. And those deeper meanings, that motivation, is what is going to actually ultimately carry you through and help you become more successful at the language, irrespective of how difficult it is. So let's get specific. In terms of how long it takes to learn Spanish or Italian, if you are studying intensively, and so let's say 3 hours a day, which is kind of an intensive study program by all accounts. So you're studying for 3 hours a day, it's going to take you about 6 months to learn both Spanish, or not both, either Spanish or Italian, to a B2 level. B2 is upper intermediate level. And I always use this as the kind of barometer for learning to speak a language by comparing different languages, right? Because the thing about the B2 level is it is the point at which you are able to hold a genuine conversation with friends, co-workers, people you meet in the street, without anyone kind of bending over backwards to accommodate you. You can understand most of what you hear, you can explain yourself fairly articulately, you can have genuine friends in the language at a B2 level. So if the question is how long does it take to get to that B2 level, the answer for both Spanish and Italian is about 6 months of intensive study, which is a relatively short amount of time, right? You might hear that time frame and think, well, that's not all that long, and indeed it's not. I have a language difficulty guide that we produced here at StoryLearning, and with this guide, we looked at not only how relatively difficult are different languages, but also how easy or difficult is a language. What happens when you know another language at the beginning of the learning journey, right? So, for example, I learned Spanish first, and then I learned Italian afterwards, and I found Italian considerably easier to learn than when I learned Spanish. Now, is that because Italian is easier than Spanish? No, not at all. It's because I already knew Spanish. And so concepts, things like, grammatical concepts, pronunciation like rolling your R's, even some kind of cultural elements, noun gender or whatever, were a lot easier because I already had that understanding of Spanish, right? So this language difficulty guide that we've got is interesting because it will show you which languages give you a leg up when learning a different type of language. Anyway, you can download the language difficulty guide for free. We'll put a link in the description there in case you'd like to check it out. But when we're talking about what makes a language easy or difficult to learn, there's a whole bunch of different factors. The most important of which, or the most relevant of which, is what I just spoke about, which is the distance from English. So if you're learning a language like Spanish or Italian, it's not that distant from English linguistically, and so a lot more is familiar, and that's going to make it easier for you to learn. If you're an English speaker and you're learning Mandarin Chinese, there's almost nothing in common, so by definition it's harder because literally every single thing that you learn, no matter how advanced you get in the language, you've got to put in an equal amount of effort. One of the interesting quirks of learning a Romance language like Spanish or Italian is actually the more advanced you get, the easier it becomes, because a lot of the more difficult vocabulary you will find is the same as English, because technical vocabulary, scientific stuff, tends to use those Latin roots that the languages have in common, and we know those words from English, so it kind of becomes very, very easy to guess what that word might be in Italian. And similarly, if you just hear someone mention this random scientific word in Spanish, chances are you're going to be able to guess what it is, because the more advanced you get, the more similar the words are. So there's all these different kinds of advantages. So we've got difference from English. Other elements would include things like the alphabet or the script. Obviously, you've got to learn Chinese characters. Then it's going to take you a couple of years before you can even read, right? But with Spanish or Italian, you can read from day one. So huge advantage there. Sentence construction, how do you put sentences together? Is it a similar thought pattern as in English, or do you have to kind of put ideas in different places? You've got grammar. Obviously, Eastern European, Slavic languages have very, very difficult grammar that require a lot of adaptation for us, for English speakers. There's things like tones. Does the language have a tonal system, which makes it more difficult? So there are lots of different factors that make a language easier or harder to learn. With both Spanish and Italian, they both share similar attributes that make the language easier to get to grips with for English speakers. So for example, cognates, we've spoken about that a bunch already. These shared roots in words, so it makes it a lot easier to learn from the beginning. In fact, in our StoryLearning Uncovered courses, where we teach these languages from scratch, we actually have, in every module of the course, we have a section on cognates, and that is, we go through the course is based on a story. We show you the story, we have you read and listen to the story, and immediately start to teach you the cognates which are there, because the thing about cognates is that it instantly unlocks a huge amount of the language. And in Spanish or Italian, it probably unlocks about a third of the language, at least 20-30% of the language on day one, if you can recognize what those cognates are, because they're so close to English, right? So there's lots of cognates between Italian and Spanish and English. For the most part, you pronounce both languages as you see them. There's a strong connection between the spelling and the pronunciation, unlike English, by the way, which is a nightmare. For those guys, for the Spanish and the Italians learning English, it's an absolute nightmare, because we will write words down and say them in a completely different way. Think of words like through, thorough. It's like, is anyone's? You have to learn the word basically totally disconnected from the spelling. And then we've also spoken already about how vocabulary at higher levels tends to be the same because of those shared roots, right? So that's why we would generally consider these languages easier to learn. Now, I mean, I do have a feeling that in terms of learning to speak the language, Spanish, I think, is slightly more problematic certainly for us Brits, and probably for Americans as well. And I think this is not a hill that I'm going to die on, but I kind of feel that with Spanish, your pronunciation with Spanish is a little bit more restricted. I mean, both Italian and Spanish are syllable-timed languages, which means for the most part, every sound that you pronounce in the language has the same amount of stress, right? It's not like English, where every word in English, which is a stress-timed language, every word in English has its own stress. Like, you think of the word English, English, you have to stress the word in and not glish, because if you say English, well, now it doesn't make sense, right? That's a stress time. So both Italian and Spanish are syllable-timed languages, but Italian is curious because it has kind of elements of stress time in it as well. It's more expressive. The sound of Italian, there's a lot more variety of expression in the sounds of the language. It has elements of stress in it, even though it's still a syllable-timed language. And I think that just makes it a little bit more familiar for us as native English speakers. The pronunciation is just that bit more familiar for us. Whereas with Spanish, you do have to adopt a different sound world in Spanish, a little bit like you might do in a language like French as well, where you have to get used to opening your mouth and using your throat in strange ways. So, you know, I would say that Spanish pronunciation is perhaps a little bit more difficult to really embody that language, but yeah, it's not a big deal. And then in Italian, the other thing that tends to stump people is the issue of dialects, right? Because in Italian, you have standard Italian, which everyone in Italy can speak, even if they don't, they can. And then you've got these different dialects in different regions. And, you know, people get very hung up on this and they say, oh, well, I'm going to live in Florence, so I have to learn the local Florentine dialect. Otherwise, no one's going to understand me. In reality, it's not a big deal, because you can go anywhere in Italy, speak standard Italian, you will be absolutely fine. It's a little bit like with Spanish. People get hung up on regional differences. So they say, oh, well, I want to learn Mexican Spanish, so I can't speak with this Colombian person, or I can't learn from a Spanish textbook. But in reality, 99% of the language is the same, sort of wherever you go. So, you know, these are minor things, and they're things that people get a bit het up about, but they're really not worth worrying about all that much. To get to grips with Spanish and Italian, the sort of things you really have to do are, first of all, getting your head around the verb conjugations, because there is stuff to learn there in different tenses as well. So, you know, present continuous, different forms of the past. You've got to learn your verbs and your grammar. And then really doing enough listening practice. This goes for all languages really, but making sure that you listen enough, because again, the problem that Brits and Americans, native English speakers, the problem that we have is that we feel embarrassed speaking with a very different accent. There's just something in our brain that blocks us there. And so it's really important just to do as much listening as you possibly can, talking with people, movies, TV, podcasts, things like that, so that the language becomes normal. Because the more normal the language becomes in your brain, the less weird you're going to feel about trying to make that to do like what feels like an exaggerated accent in the language. But ultimately, the way that you know that you've got fluent in the language, in my view, is when you can pass the pub test, my famous pub test. And the pub test is simply, can you walk into a pub, sit down, have a conversation with someone, and they do not bend over backwards to speak slowly or simply because they know you can't keep up? Will they just speak to you normally in their language, and can you both enjoy the conversation? If the answer to that is yes, you pass the pub test, you are probably at more or less a B2 upper intermediate level, and you can now, in my book at least, say that you are fluent in the language. And so, Dean, which is easy to learn out of Spanish and Italian for a native English speaker? Honestly, they're both the same. I could have saved 15 minutes and just told you that at the beginning, but then it wouldn't have been a very interesting podcast. So I hope that was useful in some way. Thanks very much for listening. Remember, if you want a copy of our language difficulty guide, then the link is in the description. I think you're really going to like it. And I will see you back in the next episode of the podcast.